Hi, everybody. My name is Susan Smythe Kung, and I work at the Archive of the Indigenous Languages of Latin America. And for the first time in my entire career at the Archive of the Indigenous Languages of Latin America, I am not talking about the Archive of the Indigenous Languages of Latin America. This is a research project that I have had going completely on the side since 2020, and something that I became very interested in as a result of my work at the Archive of the Indigenous Languages of Latin America, which I'm having to say over and over again because I haven't gotten to plug it here at this conference that often. So pardon the plugs and the jokes, which are bad. Um, so the I'm actually going to read this presentation because I've got a lot to say, and the slides are going to be, apart from this one and a couple of others, they're going to be pretty pictures for you to look at. So if you take a nap, I will not be offended, but you won't learn so much there is to learn about applying Creative Commons licenses to language documentation materials. Okay, so that was the preamble. In 1992, Michael Krauss penned his now famous call to action to the field of linguistics that you see here on the screen before you. Many linguists answered Krauss's call to action, and a new subfield, language documentation, emerged. The 1990s also brought the advent of digital recording technology, as well as broader access to the internet. I know that many people in this room were born in the 1990s and don't remember what the before times were like. So here's everything that's happened since your birth, because it's been really significant and we've seen a lot of change. So the internet provided quick and easy digital sharing, and that in turn gave rise to the open access movement. The Creative Commons licenses were released in 2002, and they contribute a lot to the open access movement by facilitating legal sharing of digital creations. Within 10 years of Krauss's call to action, several digital language archives were established with goals to preserve recordings of understudied and underdocumented languages and to provide online access to those recordings. Many more such archives have been established since, and many traditional brick and mortar archives have since digitized and made available their physical language collections. Then within another 10 years after Krauss's call to action, granting programs specifically for documenting endangered languages were established, and many funders began to require that the results of sponsored language documentation be released as open access publications, okay? Not releasing all the data as open access, but the publications had to be released as open access. And the physical collections needed to be archived, not necessarily open access, okay? But there's a lot of misunderstanding about what exactly the definition of open access is. And just because you can get something freely somewhere does not mean that it is really an open access item. So the synchrony of all of these events has resulted in a plethora of discrete, born digital files that are the results of language documentation. Many of these files are or will be archived in digital repositories, where for the most part they are publicly accessible in the sense of Safe at Any Port et al. 2019. So if you're not familiar with that paper, please download it and read it, because it makes clear there's a difference between public accessibility and open access. So these materials are available for consultation, sharing, and reuse for educational purposes. Okay, so in my abstract, I used the term language documentation data to describe these files, but I've since come to realize that this assemblage of digital content represents more than just the results of language documentation and includes the material results of what Leonard 2017 calls language work. This is his umbrella term or expression to include language documentation, description, teaching, advocacy, and resource development. In this talk, I use the term materials when reference to language work alone is not sufficient. While some material content of language work is not protected by copyright law, a great deal of it is, and specific types of language work materials might be protected automatically in some countries, but not protected at all in others. Furthermore, since copyright endures for 50 to 100 years after the death of the creator, depending on the jurisdiction, Archive users wishing to create derivatives or reproductions of archived works must seek permission from the creators or their heirs. The difficulty in finding and contacting creators or their heirs, or the heirs of their heirs, or the heirs of those heirs of those heirs, results in a proliferation of archived orphan works locked in copyright for long periods of time. One solution for creators of digital language materials is to apply an open license, such as the Creative Commons licenses, which I will call CCLs, or just CCL for short. CCLs allow creators to easily license their digital creations so that it's immediately apparent how the creation may be reused. However, it's important to critically examine what it means to apply a license, a Creative Commons license, to digital creations that result from language work. While I do believe that the application of these licenses can help ameliorate negative impacts that archived orphan works have on language research, revitalization, and reclamation, I caution that application of CCLs to language work must be carefully considered with due diligence paid to Indigenous data sovereignty protocols. This is the most important slide I'm going to show today. So I must emphasize that I am not a lawyer. I cannot give legal advice. This presentation does not contain legal advice, and this presentation should not be interpreted as legal advice. Yeah. Creative Commons makes me say that every time I, appropriately so, because I'm not a lawyer. Okay, so now that the disclaimer is out of the way, I want to explore these questions. What are some of the complexities of copyright with respect to language work, and especially to traditional knowledge? When is it appropriate to apply a Creative Commons license to a language work, and when should they be avoided? What factors should be considered when choosing a Creative Commons license, and how can they support the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance? Copyright, just a quick review for those of you who already know this, I apologize, but copyright is a set of several rights, including the right to distribute or share a work and the right to create derivative works or adaptations. Copyright automatically applies to creative work at the moment it's created, and these rights belong exclusively to the creator for the duration of their life and to their heirs for an additional 50 to 100 years after their death, depending on the jurisdiction. And by that, I mean the country and the laws that apply. Thereafter, the work passes into the public domain, where it may be reused or adapted by anyone for any purpose. Determining copyright for many materials resulting from language work can be challenging. Western legal systems hinge on concepts of creativity, originality, authorship, and limited monopoly. Facts about the world and common knowledge are not protected by copyright and are thus considered to be in the public domain by traditional copyright law. A great deal of content that results from language work falls into this category. These content types include, but are not limited to, words in a language, traditional stories that are common knowledge within a community, procedures for doing tasks such as planting and harvesting food or building a house. The copyright status of language work materials is further complicated by this issue. Even if the content of a recording, such as a traditional story, could fall into the public domain in the eyes of Western copyright law, a particular recorded example of that content might be creative enough to be protected by copyright. If we add an element of creativity and authorship to the items in these bullets, then all of these products probably would be protected by copyright, and in some countries they might definitely be protected by copyright. Furthermore, what's considered creative enough to be protected by copyright can vary greatly between jurisdictions. So there's no simple test that can be applied in all cases. And this situation becomes more complex when we consider traditional knowledge. Many of the things that copyright law considers to be common knowledge or facts about the world are actually traditional knowledge of the indigenous peoples that they come from. The World Intellectual Property Organization, or what I'm going to call WIPO, and everybody has their own pronunciation of that acronym, But WIPO defines TK as knowledge, know-how, skills, and practices that are developed and sustained and passed on from generation to generation within a community, often forming part of its cultural or spiritual identity. Under this definition, traditional cultural expressions, or TCEs, which are a subcategory of traditional knowledge, they include folklore, music, dance, art, design, ceremonies, and narratives. Clearly, a lot of the content of language work falls under the definition of TCE. The 2007 United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples clearly establishes Indigenous sovereignty over their histories, languages, oral traditions, philosophies, writing systems, literature, and their intellectual property in all its forms. The point at hand here is that the intellectual property that's protected by the UN Declaration is exactly the same kind of intellectual property that Western copyright law considers to be in the public domain. WIPO suggests using copyright and trademarks as ways to protect contemporary, I'm going to stress contemporary adaptations of TCEs, and many Indigenous peoples in the United States and Canada are doing this, and some are turning to Creative Commons licenses to facilitate the open sharing of their language work while simultaneously emphasizing their ownership over the work. The primary problem with applying Creative Commons licenses to some kinds of language work lies in the fact that Creative Commons licenses work in conjunction with copyright. And there's this tension between Western copyright law and the nature of Indigenous intellectual property. These tensions revolve around questions of authorship. So who's the author of traditional knowledge, if it's traditional? Originality, if everyone in a community knows a particular story, is it original? Where's the originality? Duration, copyright is meant to end eventually, but traditional knowledge is meant to endure for generations. And fixation in a tangible medium requires fixation of something that has traditionally been intangible or oral and passed on orally. I don't know how well this shows up. Yeah, you can see that this is a tug of war. So the primary problem with applying Creative Commons licenses to some kinds of language work materials lies in the fact that CC licenses, oh, I'm sorry, I already read that. Another area of tension happens at the intersection of the open access movement, to which Creative Commons belongs, and Indigenous data sovereignty movement. So here there's a conflict between the ease of access, for which the open movement advocates, and the possibility that ease of access could, and often does, result in appropriation and exploitation of Indigenous knowledge. Further, using Creative Commons licenses on something indicates, and this is really important, using a Creative Commons license on something indicates that it is intended for broad distribution and use or reuse. So they're not intended for things that need to remain confidential and that should have limited distribution, okay? So let's get that clear and out of the way at the very beginning. Well, we're not at the beginning, I'm halfway through. But it's out of the way now. Okay, so any decisions to apply Creative Commons licenses to language work that includes traditional knowledge needs to be undertaken by the relevant Indigenous community that owns the knowledge. However, it's important to remember that one, not all language work materials include traditional knowledge or TCEs, and two, the types of traditional knowledge that need to be protected differ greatly between communities. For the subset of materials that apply for allow for sharing and qualify for copyright protection, then Creative Commons licenses can be an equitable alternative to copyright alone. So note on this particular slide, these are the 6 Creative Commons licenses, and every single one of them has the little person icon with by next to it. So this means that free and open sharing is always allowed by all of the Creative Commons licenses, provided that the creator always, that creators are always appropriately attributed or cited. The question of authorship must be addressed before application of a license. Con 2018A suggests that when applying a Creative Commons license to a work, A legally recognized community could be attributed as the author, similarly to how universities or corporations might be attributed as authors of certain works. Even though this type of corporate authorship might change the duration of the copyright, it will help enforce the community's ownership of the intellectual property, and it can be seen as an act of reclamation in that the Indigenous community establishes itself as the creator of a digital work and thereby claims the copyright to that creation and further controls how the creation can be used by others. The ND element stands for no derivatives, and it specifies that no adaptations of a work bearing this icon can be shared or distributed in any way. In practice, the two CC licenses that include this element have been used to protect works that include traditional or other knowledge that can be shared, but that must not be changed, adapted, or taken out of context. The SA element stands for share alike. These two licenses are the CC version of copyleft licenses because the share alike element is when this element is included, all adaptations of the work must be shared using the same license. So it's self-perpetuating. The share-alike element allows for community-specific reuse, including adaptation and remixing to create new materials that would in turn have to be licensed under the same SA license. Since commercial use is allowed by the CC by SA license, communities could even allow their members to, or collaborators to create some sort of commercial merchandise that could then be used, for example, to help fund language programs. The CC by NCSA license can help prevent outside commercial exploitation. And that brings us to the NC element, which indicates no commercial use of the licensed work is allowed. When the community is recognized as the author and a non-commercial license is applied, the community retains commercial control of that intellectual property, and they're free to use it commercially if they choose, or license someone else to use it if they choose. The care principles, which thankfully Mark already told us a lot about, but the care principles grew out of the need to ensure that Indigenous peoples retain sovereignty over their data, even when it's outside their control or their immediate control or even their not immediate control. They can ensure that their traditions and knowledge are taken into consideration in the process of handling, storing, preserving, sharing, and reusing the data. The care principles are intended to be used in conjunction with the FAIR guiding principles for data management and stewardship, as evidenced by the hashtag #BeFair and Care. But I will add that the FAIR principles came first, and the care principles were a bit of a reaction to the FAIR principles. It should go without saying that the care principles should be followed throughout the entire life cycle of language work. And here I offer some ideas on how the application of Creative Commons licenses to digital language materials may be aligned with the care principles. The C stands for collective benefit, and Creative Commons licenses allow for Indigenous peoples to collectively benefit from the content of a work in ways that all rights reserved model of copyright does not allow. When a Creative Commons license is applied to a work, anyone, including Indigenous peoples, can share the work freely and reuse or adapt it according to the terms of the license. A stands for authority to control, and all CC licenses require attribution for the authors. When these licenses are applied to language works, those works are attributed to Indigenous peoples, either individuals or collectives, and then Indigenous peoples maintain control over that work, which in turn facilitates language reclamation efforts. R stands for responsibility. Everyone engaged in language work, I hope, wants the resulting materials to be used responsibly for the good of the language community. CC licenses facilitate responsible reuse because they clearly indicate the type of reuse that's allowed. Use of any of the CC licenses will ensure that Indigenous peoples are appropriately attributed, provided that they're listed as authors of the work. Licenses with the NC element help to ameliorate commercial misuse, and license with the ND element can help prevent misappropriation of the language, traditional knowledge, and cultural heritage. Finally, license with the SA element ensure that any resulting adaptations must be shared under the same license, further mitigating the chances for misuse and misappropriation. And finally, E stands for ethics. And Mark said this was an add-on, but I kind of think of this as if only it had come first, because then it would indicate that ethics needs to be applied throughout the entire application of the rest of the principles. But as the CARE principles state, Indigenous peoples' rights and well-being should be a primary concern. The same holds true in the application of Creative Commons licenses to language materials. Simply taking the time to engage in conversations about attribution and licensing helps to promote the ethical treatment of Indigenous peoples and their languages and knowledge. So I hope I've successfully demonstrated that while Creative Commons licenses might not be appropriate for all types of language work, there are benefits to applying them to certain materials on a case-by-case basis, and that they can help support Indigenous data sovereignty. In closing, I cannot stress enough how important it is that language workers and researchers, regardless of their indigeneity, collaborate with the relevant Indigenous communities to arrive at satisfactory arrangements for the ownership and licensing of their work. That satisfactory arrangement might or might not include application of Creative Commons licenses to some or all of the materials. This QR code leads to my list of references, which is pretty long, and as well as a few examples of licenses of works by Indigenous peoples that are licensed with Creative Commons licenses. And at this point, it's a short list because I was only looking for works, contemporary works that were created by Indigenous peoples and not projects that were led by external researchers working with Indigenous peoples. So it's a pretty short list. I wanted to know how are Indigenous peoples using these Creative Commons licenses to meet their needs and their purposes. So that's it. Thank you very much.